Hey guys, today we're in the book of Genesis, chapter 47. So we're picking up off of Joseph going to Pharaoh. He brings some of his brothers and his father along and says, hey, they need some land, right? And he tells them that uh, we are herdsmen. We keep livestock and we need a place to dwell. And notice in verse 4, it says, please let your servants dwell. Even though Joseph was the number two guy of Egypt, he had all the power in the world. They still had to ask Pharaoh for a section of land, right? Pharaoh is still the boss. He's still the king, right? And so he does this. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come. Give them the best of the land. It is only through the blessing of Joseph that these Hebrews get the best of the land. Joseph is who saved Egypt, who has made Pharaoh probably one of the greatest kings that has ever lived. And so it is only through the goodness of Joseph that Pharaoh gives this blessing. And so Joseph took them. Uh, uh, um, Joseph came and got his dad Jacob and brought him to Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked him how old he is, but notice what he says. And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of my years of sojourning are 130 years old. That word sojourning means traveler or passing through. Jacob knows that this world, the promised land or Egypt, is not his home. He knows that his place is to be with God. And he says, I've been sojourning for 130 years, but I still haven't reached home, right? I still haven't made it. And so he goes on, they talk a little bit, and notice verse 10, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Now, when you read that, you probably just read through it pretty quickly, but it's very significant. Pharaoh is considered a god. Pharaoh is considered the embodiment of Ra, the main chief god of all of Egypt. And so for a Hebrew to bless Pharaoh, a god, with another god is almost an insult, saying that you are not the god, but somehow Jacob gets away with this blessing of showing him that I'm blessing you, Pharaoh, who thinks you're a god, but I'm blessing you with the one true God. And so I'm sure it wasn't intended in that measure, but normally Pharaoh would have not accepted that blessing and cut it off. But we can see that God allows that to happen, and God has been working probably through the life and through the words of Joseph on that particular Pharaoh. Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Goshen, as they said, and now there was no food in all of the land, not just in Egypt, not just in Canaan, but in the world. This 7-year famine has infected the whole world, and there is nothing. And so, what happened? The people of Egypt came to Joseph and they said, we need food. Verse 14 says, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt, in the land of Canaan, people were starving. This has gone so long that people have run out of money to buy food, right? To buy the grain. Joseph did a great job, and there's plenty of food in Egypt, but now the people of Egypt and the people of the world don't have any money to buy the food because they've already spent it on the first and second, third, fourth year, right? So we're getting towards the end of this severe famine. And so Joseph, being smart, he says, well, you don't have any money, but you do have animals. You do have livestock. So here's the deal. I won't charge you money, but you start bringing me your animals. And he says he exchanges them for horses and flocks and herds and donkeys. And so what happens is not only did Joseph collect a lot of money for Pharaoh, but now Joseph is building up all the horses and donkeys, all the livestock, everything is being owned by Pharaoh, okay? Which horses and donkeys will lean itself into war. So Pharaoh, the more horses you have, the more chariots you have, which means you're a stronger army. So of course, Pharaoh is loving this, but eventually they run out of livestock and they're still saying, but we're hungry. Now we have no money, we have no livestock. What can we do? And so the people say, buy us and buy our land. Don't let us just starve to death. We'll go into servitude to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh can buy our land as long as he lets us live on it. And that's exactly what happens. In verse 20, Joseph bought all the land of Egypt to Pharaoh, and all the Egyptians sowed their fields because the famine was severe on them, and the land became Pharaoh. The Pharaoh over Joseph probably became the richest and the most expanding Pharaoh of any Egyptian Pharaoh because of this. And so you can imagine that even though all this is happening and there's still a Hebrew second in charge, God is blessing Pharaoh and allowing Joseph to stay there and to keep them and allowing people to be able to continue to grow and to prosper during this famine. That's important because God's promise says, I will make you a great nation. He needs these people to prosper so they can become a nation. And so Joseph goes in, he does all of this. And notice in verse 26, it says, Joseph made a statute, he made a law concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have a fifth. If you remember at the beginning of the story of Joseph, I told you that Egyptians' first law was that they would give a tenth. Now they've been giving a 20th, right? They've been giving a fifth of all of their goods for this famine that was upcoming. But now that the famine is almost over, Joseph puts into rule, Pharaoh agrees that now Pharaoh will get 20%. Now you might think to yourself, man, that's a lot, right? 10% to 20%. How do people love Joseph and Pharaoh? I think you today would love to only pay 20% in taxes. Am I right? Right? 20% is not that much, right? This is their welfare system. This is all the things put in our government does. They're only paying a 20th. And so it starts a new law, which Pharaoh loves, right? Because now it's a law that he's going to get even more. And thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt and the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and they were fruitful and multiplied. That's important, right? That's what we call creation languages, right? Genesis language. Remember, God told them to be fruitful and multiply. So now they are doing well under the blessings of God through Joseph. And so they are being fruitful and multiply. And then we finish chapter 47 with a sad note that Jacob knows he's going to die. He calls Joseph in and he says, hey, son, don't let me die in Egypt. I need to be back in the promised land. I need to be back where my father and my grandfather is. Make me a promise that you'll take me back to the promised land and bury me where my father and Abraham is. And so Joseph swears by this, and Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. And so that's where we're at. So you would ask yourself, well, this is an interesting chapter, but where is Jesus? We can see that even in amongst all of the bad things that are happening, Joseph is still there and still working for the good of God's promise. That's exactly where Jesus is at in our life. Sometimes we're in a bad season, but he is always working good for his kingdom and for his will. Hope that makes sense, and we will see you tomorrow in chapter 48. God bless.